Consider supporting me on Patreon, where you can see my videos a day early and receive other fun perks. So it's finally here. After years of waiting, Psychonauts 2 has finally been released. I haven't been this excited for a game in a long time, and as such, I don't think it would be right to just do a normal review. Instead, I think I should give a bit of background first. Don't worry, there's a timestamp for if you want to skip ahead to the actual review part. I played the original Psychonauts about 10 years ago, sometime in 2012 I think, and it was a really special game to me. It was my first game I played on Steam, and the idea of being able to play a full-fledged console game on my laptop was really special to me. Even though it didn't run especially well on my seriously outdated laptop, and I was playing with keyboard controls because I didn't know how to set up a controller, I still loved it. It quickly became my favorite game of all time, although it's since been dethroned, and I've been hoping for a sequel ever since. I've never been more hungry for a sequel to any video game ever. Not only does the game feel like it's over way too fast, but the original Psychonauts has a lot of problems that became more and more apparent during my many replays. Honestly, if I didn't love the good stuff so much, it would have been a pretty good contender for games I love and hate. So the idea of a sequel that would build on Psychonauts' strengths and fix its weaknesses was really appealing, more so than sequels to other great games. I'd love to see a sequel to Kid Icarus Uprising or an Okami sequel on hardware that makes sense, but I'll be fine if those never come to be. With Psychonauts 2 though, I was desperate for a sequel, and in 2016, my wishes were granted with a Kickstarter for Psychonauts 2. I quickly backed the Hall of Brains tier and then got to waiting. Now, there was a lot of skepticism surrounding the Kickstarter at the time, and most of it was pretty justified. After all, look at Double Fine's game output post-Brutal Legend. It's a mixed bag. Some of it's good, some's middling, some's outright bad, but all of it's pretty small in terms of scope. So a sequel to Psychonauts would be very different from what they typically made. And then there's Broken Age, one of the most infamous Kickstarter games out there, which I think is a bit unfair. I mean, what happened? The game released the first half separately, then released the second half a year later, and it wasn't as good and relied heavily on existing assets. I'm sorry, as someone familiar with the utter dumpster fire that is Hiveswap, I just can't take that seriously. 8 parts, first one is a year late, the second comes 3 years later, is a massive technical downgrade and retcons a lot of the spin-off. The focus on the game likely led to the decay of the comic it was based on. There were a number of scandals behind the scenes, and the entire company in charge, along with the franchise it's based on, is going under. But anyway, I was supposed to be talking about Broken Age. While I think some people exaggerate how bad this situation was, and I wound up liking the final product, an experienced developer being given this much money and experiencing this many problems is pretty concerning. Plus, there's the fact the Psychonauts 2 campaign wasn't actually a Kickstarter and was on this new website called Fig, which some found suspicious. Then, of course, similar Kickstarters like Mighty No. 9 went up in flames, which was a pretty big blow to my confidence. However, when I saw Rhombus of Ruin was being worked on, that actually raised my confidence a bit. They talked about it as sort of a warm-up, which makes sense since it's been over a decade since the original, so it helps them get back into the groove of things. Plus, it gives them a chance to make a new graphical engine, move the story to where they want it to be, and get more funds. Then, of course, there were the delays. Psychonauts 2 was originally supposed to come out in 2018, which sounded insane even before Rhombus of Ruin was announced. It was quickly delayed to 2019, but things still didn't seem right. After all, it was supposed to come out in spring, but the first trailer was at the 2018 Game Awards. If the first trailer was then, there's no way they were far along enough, and that turned out to be true because it was delayed to 2020. Deep down, I knew that was going to happen, but I was holding out hope that it wouldn't. Still, it seemed like it would finally come out in 2020, but then the virus hit, and it was announced they were bought by Microsoft, allowing them to increase the scope of the game, but also delaying it to 2021. I could tell even Tim understood that the fans were getting tired of the delays because he assured everyone that the game would come out in 2021 and provided detail this time, saying that everything that was going to be in the game was already there and that they were just polishing everything. Tim also made a point about not doing crunch, which is a breath of fresh air given all the horror stories stories we've seen surrounding games like Cyberpunk and The Last of Us 2. I'm not gonna act all high and mighty, as I would have been hyped either way, but it's still nice to know people's lives weren't ruined in the process of making this game. Back to the release date, I actually predicted the game was coming out in August, and I have the tweets to prove it. The months quickly counted down until the game surprisingly went live the night of the 24th instead of the 25th, which was a bit weird. I was a bit worried about my computer being able to run it since I didn't have the recommended specs, and even more worried about my friend being able to run it after I sent him my spare code, but in the end it worked for both of us. Why am I telling you all this? Well, waiting for the game was its own journey. It was a big deal for me, and I figured I should establish the stakes before jumping into this. But anyway, did the game live up to the hype? Was it all worth it? Let's find out. Starting with the story, this game picks up right where Rhombus of Ruin left off. Truman Zanato has been rescued from Dr. Lobato, but we also know Lobato couldn't have done this on his own, and after a quick investigation in his mind, the gang learns two things. 1. Lobato was hired by someone inside the Psychonauts, and 2. This person wants to resurrect the evil psychic known as Maligula, who was defeated by the founding members of the Psychonauts 20 years ago. So that sets up a compelling mystery and a serious threat right off the bat. The story doesn't really focus on the mystery of who the mole is, it's more dedicated to stopping Maligula's return, but it still has a lot of good reveals, including the identity of the mole. Another important aspect of this story is the fact it expands on elements of the original that were only mentioned a few times at most. Ford's Shattered Mind and Raz's Water Curse did play important roles in the story, but mostly as explanations for other plot points rather than as core parts of the story. Here, both elements are heavily focused on, and it's really well done. You learn a lot about the histories of Raz's family and the Psychonauts as the game goes on. The game's also notably darker than the original. It still keeps the early 2000s Nickelodeon tone of the first game, but it has plenty of heavy emotional moments as well, which the first game didn't have a lot of. Then there's the storytelling in the mines, which I feel is also improved. It uses the same clever method of storytelling through the levels that the original did, but there are some improvements. For starters, like I said, there are heavier emotional moments in these levels. Sure, the original had tragic stuff in the levels too, but it was mostly relegated to the vaults. Here, they're a bit more willing to let things get uncomfortable, and it always works. These moments never feel unearned or slow down the gameplay. It all feels organic. The other improvement is the connections to the main story. In the original, only about half of the mines had any connection to the overarching plot. It's kind of funny to think about, but most of the best levels in that game were technically filler. Here, every level contributes to the overarching story. They don't always move the plot forward, but they always connect either to the current situation or the larger backstory that so much of this game hinges on. I do have some complaints with the plot, but they're pretty minor. For starters, while this game is still funny, it isn't as joke-heavy as the original, so that might be a turn-off for some. The original is definitely funnier. There are a few inconsistencies, like Raz's dad being implied to be a powerful psychic in the first game, but struggling to light a pine cone here, but those are easy to overlook. There is one reveal that I think really should have been thought through better, and a couple things that should have been explained better, but neither of those issues were at the core of the story they were telling. Then there's the quote from Hollis. You know the one.
We're not here to change people's minds, Raz. Not here to fix people. We're here to help people fight their own demons.
I know, it's just one line, but it's arguably the most important line in the game. It comes after Raz does some seriously questionable stuff inside Hollis's mind. It's meant to serve as a discussion of the ethics of entering someone's mind and make Raz confront these ideas early on. It actually prompts Raz to ask before going into someone's mind in any situation he reasonably can. The problem is this quote doesn't actually connect to what's going on. Raz wasn't trying to fix Hollis, he was trying to manipulate her. Meanwhile, immediately after this talk, the main goal becomes fixing Ford's mind, which is treated as the right thing to do. She should have said something along the lines of how you have to have someone's best interests at heart when entering their mind, and in fact, Sasha essentially says just that.
Next time you find yourself in someone's mind and it occurs to you to overreach your boundaries, use this.
Smelling salts?
These will cause you to exit the brain immediately before any damage is done.
The reason it bugs me so much is because it's supposed to be at the core of this game's discussion of entering someone's mind, but the line doesn't make much sense in context and feels like it was just written for the trailers so they could get points for addressing the criticisms about Raz curing people's mental illnesses in the first game. Still, this game does a better job of discussing the ethics of entering someone's mind than any other game I've seen do this idea. Moving away from the plot, how are the characters? Starting with the characters from the first game, they're pretty good. They still feel like themselves from the original Psychonauts, and you get to interact with them a bit more now due to the long list of dialogue options. Despite this, it feels like most of them fade into the background to make room for the new characters. I was really surprised how much of a non-entity Coach Oleander wound up being after the tutorial. The old characters have some important moments here and there, but for the most part, the story isn't about them, which I'm fine with. The only two exceptions to this are Augustus, who I'll get to in a bit, and Ford. Ford was my favorite character in the original, and that's true here too. A lot of this game plot revolves around him and his shattered mind, and learning so much about his past puts him in a whole new light and makes him even more compelling. Also, there are no surprise cameos from old characters. You won't get anything more than a reference to the campers or the asylum crew, which I'm fine with, since while that would have been cool, it also would have felt like they were leaning a bit too hard on the first game. As for the new characters, they can essentially be divided into three categories: the interns, Raz's family, and the Psychonauts. Starting with the interns, they're essentially meant as this game's version of the Whispering Rock campers, and I honestly think they're a downgrade. I'm not gonna act like every camper was amazing or even good. I mean, can you honestly tell me you remember anything about Chops? There were a lot of standouts though, like Vernon, Maloof, and Bobby, and there were so many characters and storylines involving them you could overlook the less interesting ones. Here, there's only 6 interns, so there's a lot more pressure for them to stand out, and most of them don't. Adam is easily the worst at standing out, as there's a good chance you won't see him in the mother lobe because he blends in with all the random people milling about. He's nicer than the others and is interested in Psychonauts history, but you'll probably just remember him as the yo-yo guy. Gisu is a rebel skateboarder and probably the least interesting of the bunch. Morris is running a pirate radio station and wants Gisu to join. Seriously, pirate radio is all he talks about, but it isn't really fleshed out. Norma and Lizzie are the main bullies that target Raz, and neither of them compare to Bobby Zilch. Okay, Lizzie's a decently fun character, but Norma isn't very interesting, and despite getting the most screen time of the bunch, I felt like I understood her the least. Then there's Sam. Sam is the best new character in this game. She's freaking hilarious. She's got this eccentric weirdness to her, coupled with complete confidence in what she's doing. It makes her really entertaining, and honestly, I like her better than any of the campers. Overall, I liked the idea of the interns, but I don't think they served their purpose well enough. They're supposed to be a peer group for Raz, but after the casino segment, which is pretty early in the game, they don't do much until the final battle, at which point you haven't gotten to know them nearly as well as the game seems to think you have. The original had a similar problem with the campers disappearing halfway through the game, but that was a necessary evil because the plot revolved around saving them. Here, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to go back to the earlier areas and hear more from these guys after getting to Green Needle Gulch, but we'll get to that later. Long story short, they were a great idea that needed more care and attention. Next is Raz's family, who actually provides some pretty compelling drama. You see, Augustus has turned over a new leaf, and now is not only supportive of Raz's journey to become a Psychonaut, but is actually teaching himself to better use his own powers. Sounds like a pretty big 180 from when he shunned everything psychic, but I think any decent parent would seriously reevaluate their parenting style after witnessing the horrors of the meat circus. However, just because Augustus has turned over a new leaf doesn't mean everyone else has. After all, if your dad spent your entire life telling you psychics were dangerous and evil, and he suddenly became cool with them, you'd probably have trouble adjusting too. And if your brother ran away from the family to join said psychics, you might not be inclined to instantly forgive him. Most of Raz's family members aren't that interesting individually, but the conflict they present him with is pretty interesting, showing us the fallout of the first game's events. Finally, we have the Psychonauts. Most of the minds in this game take place inside the minds of the different Psychonauts, so that's the main way you learn about them. I could tell you who my favorites were, but I feel like that would be a spoiler if I explained why. I will say, I do find it kind of weird that we never got to go into Otto's mind, and if I were to guess, I'd say there was originally going to be an Otto level, but they just ran out of time, which is totally fair. The game needed to come out at some point, and Otto needed the mental world treatment less than anyone else. Anyway, with all that story info out of the way, let's get to the presentation, starting with the music because I have less to say about it. On one hand, it all sounds nice, fits with the mood of the areas it plays in, and feels in line with the style of the original's music. On the other hand, it's not very memorable. Again, maybe it's because of how many times I've played it, but there are so many tracks from the original that stuck with me. Cruller's Sacred Hall, The Watchman's Twisted Reality, Napoleon's Final Conflict, the Meat Circus theme, and so many more. They were all really memorable. Here, I'll remember them when I listen to them again, but they don't really stick with me like so many of the songs from the original did. There were a few highlights like Psyking's song, but even then, the songs that stuck with me were because of an outside factor like lyrics or similarities to a song from the first game. The game is fully voice acted, and I have no complaints about the acting, except it kinda sounds like Oleander has a different voice actor now. I can't tell for sure though. Aside from that, the voice performances are all really good. Now on to the visuals. Starting with the character designs, you may have noticed this game looks a bit different from the original, and I'm not just talking about the improved hardware. You see, in the original game, most of the character designs have this abstract, Burton-esque art style to them. Characters like Clem or Fred or so many of the others had this uniquely bizarre quality to their designs that you couldn't see anywhere else. And I think a large part of that was down to the art style and how it seemingly emphasized the weirdness of those designs. Here, the character designs are still pretty weird and creative, but feel a bit more grounded than some of the borderline mutants in the first game. Maybe that's just because its art style is more clean or doesn't emphasize jagged shapes as much. I don't really know. The only human character who matched that original level of weirdness to me was Cassie. For the record, I'm not saying this change is good or bad, I just happened to notice this shift and found it worth mentioning. What is bad is the facial movements. I actually noticed this in one of the trailers, and it was one of the few things in those trailers that made me legitimately worried about this game. In cutscenes, the facial movements look fine, but during dialogue, they look fairly awkward. It really varies from character to character. Raz's mom is probably the worst of the bunch, and Ford is easily the best. However, character design is far from the most important visual aspect of a Psychonauts game. What really matters is the world design, and the game really hit it out of the park in that regard. Every area in this game is beautiful. Each segment of the overworld has its own distinct look to it, from the Motherlobe's bustling retro-futurist aesthetic to the nice campground vibe of the questionable area. Also, quick side note, but did the questionable area remind anyone else of Gravity Falls? I mean, it's a Pacific Northwest tourist trap in the woods that makes up fake paranormal stuff and even themes itself around question marks. It could just be a coincidence, but I don't buy it. There's no way it wasn't an inspiration. And those are just the physical locations. The mental worlds are even better. The ideas are even more creative this time around, and the visuals do a great job making those ideas shine. Some highlights in that regard are Hollis's hot streak and the Psyking Sensoria. Finally, there were a few optimization issues. I got some stuttering in the quarry and questionable area, but things calmed down when I lowered my graphics settings. The same can be said for the occasional lagging during the dialogue and cutscenes, only the problem didn't fully go away when I lowered my settings. It just lessened. Once again, this could be on me since the game actively warned me I have an outdated GPU, but I won't rule out the possibility of poor optimization in the PC port. Either way, it's nothing game-breaking, just a minor nuisance. But enough about the presentation, onto the gameplay. There's a lot of ground to cover here, and I think the best way to start is with the powers, since so much hinges on them. One element the team made a big deal about improving was the powers and how they interacted with the combat. In the original, most of the powers were useless outside of a few situations that forced you to use them. Here, they tried to make every power viable in its own way. I think the best way to examine these changes is to go over each one individually. This game has 8 powers just like last time, having scrapped 3 from the original to make room for 3 new ones, and I think they picked the right 3 to get rid of. Shield only got used once or twice outside of Lungfishopolis, and the fact you had to stand still while using it really limited what you could do. Invisibility was a cool idea, but there's only so much that could have been done with it, and confusion felt really redundant. As for the returning powers, they all had some changes. Psyblast is mostly the same. This game doesn't have a manual lock-on, so it targets things automatically when you're facing them, and the targeting is pretty accurate. It also operates on a cooldown now instead of ammo, so no more ammo upgrades. Pyrokinesis is very different. Instead of targeting one enemy and holding down the button to build up the thermometer, you see an outline of a ball of fire that's going to form, and you can move around while charging it. It's nothing special at first, but it's a force to be reckoned with after a few upgrades. Telekinesis was easily the biggest step up. It's a cool idea that was implemented horribly in the original. It was always a pain when the game forced you to use it. Here, not only is it viable, but it's fun and useful. It's arguably the best power in the game. Clairvoyance is largely the same as last time, but for whatever reason, I didn't find myself using it nearly as much as in the original. Maybe it's because the couple seconds it takes to connect discouraged me, or maybe it's because of all the other powers I wanted to keep equipped, even though switching powers here is easier than last time. I don't really know. Finally, levitation was heavily nerfed, and I think that's a necessary evil. Sure, it was a lot of fun in the original, but it also let you skip half of the platforming obstacles if you knew what you were doing. As for the new powers, mental connection was a lot of fun, mainly because I'm a sucker for grappling hooks. The time bubble made for some fun platforming and was a godsend in combat, but it's also hard to aim and gets pretty frustrating when you accidentally target the wrong thing. And projection is pretty useless aside from a few puzzles, but it gets a pass from me because, well...
Look, over there! Limbo! Limbo!
Yep, they really went there. Gura's in this game. A nice improvement to all of these powers is the way the upgrades are handled. In the original, there were specific upgrades that you would get when you hit specific levels. Psychonauts 2 adopts a more modern approach, instead giving you a skill point with each level up and letting you choose which powers you want to spend those points upgrading. Each upgrade not only requires a certain number of skill points, but is also locked until you reach a certain rank, which I think is a great way to implement the rank system. It's a hell of a lot better than the pin system. The pins are a new addition, and they're a great idea in theory. Auto Shop has a wide variety of pins you can buy and equip to get different effects. This fixes the original's problem of the shop feeling kinda pointless. Think about it. In that game, you had an upgrade, a cosmetic item, an arbitrary item you need to grind for, and an item to help you grind. All of which are one-time purchases, and then you're left with a healing item you'll never need, and Psycores, which likely only existed to pad out the shop. These pins, combined with the other items in the shop, make it feel a lot more worthwhile. The problem is the way you equip them. You see, there are only 3 slots to equip your pins, and despite the fact you can upgrade your wallet, Psypop, and Dreamfluff storage, you can't upgrade your pin slots. Also, every pin is treated the same way. You want a cosmetic pin that changes the color of your levitation ball or lets you dance like Bobby Zilch? Well, that's going to take up a slot that could go to a pin that actually helps you in combat. Hell, changing the levitation color operates off of RGB rules, so if you want a white one, you can't have any other pins equipped. Yeah, you can change them at any time, but it's still weird you have to do that at all. Other games like Paper Mario don't treat cosmetic equipables the same way they treat stuff that actually helps you in battle. Also, there are some pins that have no business being equipable items, like the mental magnet or a pin that lets you get 50% off at the shop. Why do I have to equip these things? I think I'll let a character referenced in one of these pins sum it up.
You're stupid. The coach is stupid. The whole camp is stupid. That thing flying at you is stupid.
They should have just separated the pins into different categories, like battle, cosmetic, and upgrades, and only have the battle pins take up slots. That would have solved this problem and arguably made the system feel deeper. It's a shame this issue exists because the ideas behind a lot of these pins are pretty good. Also, while we're talking about items, I should mention you don't select key items anymore. They're just used automatically when you need them, which is a welcome change. Sure, it means the bacon is gone, but it would have clashed with the story here, and you don't really need it anymore. Also, don't worry, you still have the smelling salts, they're just in the pause menu this time. Also, there's more healing items now, and this time they're actually useful. Anyway, with all this talk of combat mechanics, how is the combat? Well, it's better than the first game where it was more of an afterthought. There's a wide variety of enemy types in this game, and each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, making it so each power is useful in combat in some situations. Some of the weaknesses are outright told to you, too, but there's plenty of experimentation as well. The combat also feels kind of separate from the platforming. In the first game, the enemies would usually just show up wherever you were. Here, while that happens occasionally, there are typically specific arena-shaped areas where the enemies will spawn. Kinda like the game is saying, okay, we're taking a break from the platforming to do some combat. And it definitely is a break. The platforming is the main focus here, and that's a good thing. While the combat is fun, it's not good enough to be the game's main focus. The bosses are few and far between and range from mediocre to alright, kinda like the first game. The devs made a big deal about how the Microsoft acquisition allowed them to include the bosses, but honestly, you could have cut the bosses, and aside from a few story moments that could be worked around, not much would be lost, especially since there's only 5 of them. Not to get spoilery, but I think the final boss would have been a lot better and felt more epic if it played more like a level than a boss. My biggest issue with the combat isn't about the combat itself, but rather the way checkpoints are handled. You see, dying from falling and dying from combat are treated very differently here. If your death is platforming related, you're sent back to the last stable ground you were on. Very generous. If you die from enemies, you get sent back to your last checkpoint. That divide is a bit odd, but mostly reasonable. The problem is that getting sent back also means you lose all the collectibles you got since that last checkpoint. And considering how many collectibles are in these levels, that's seriously annoying. It made me enable invincibility in certain encounters I would have otherwise tried to win legitimately. That reminds me, we have to talk about the accessibility options. Microsoft has made a big push to make their games playable by as many audiences as possible, and that's reflected in the options here. There's stuff like bigger subtitles and colorblind options, and there are some gameplay options as well. One lets you turn off fall damage, which I had no shame in using the whole time since I hate fall damage in platformers with a burning passion, and the original didn't have fall damage either. Then, instead of alternate difficulty modes, you can enable and disable narrative combat, which has you do more damage, and invincibility whenever you want. This may seem a bit cheap, but these just affect the combat. Aside from the fall damage thing, there are no cheats for the platforming or collecting, which are the real focus in this game. Speaking of which, we might as well get to the collectibles. They're mostly the same. The mental cobwebs are gone, as they were kind of redundant, and the brains have been replaced with the half-a-minds, which are far better from a gameplay standpoint. Yeah, the brains were great from a story perspective, but having the health upgrades only start appearing more than halfway through the game, and about 2/3 of them not showing up until you've beaten almost every level is atrocious from a game balance standpoint. And they only really got away with it because of how unnecessary the upgrades were. As for the returning collectibles, there are a few changes. The vaults tend to be more well hidden and take a few punches to open, which I'm not a fan of. The punching thing is just a matter of satisfaction, but as for the vaults, they're supposed to be easy to find. The emotional baggage is also harder, or at least feels that way, which I'm fine with, although I am a bit disappointed with the shortened animations. I get it's probably for the best, but I still miss the whole song and dance with these guys. Also, they don't unlock concept art anymore, which is weird. The only other notable change to the collectibles is the figments. They fixed the figments. Kind of. In the original, not only were the insides of the figments somewhat transparent, but so were the outlines, and they would pulse in and out of visibility. Here, the figments are a lot more visible, so you're a lot less likely to miss them. However, there are still areas like Psyking Sensorium where a lot of figments blend in with the scenery, and just like in the original, some of the figment placements are downright evil. However, most of the figments that I had trouble with left me saying, oh, that was clever, instead of, how the hell was I supposed to see that? Another issue is the way the collectibles are tracked. For starters, the figment menu isn't as comprehensive as last time, making it harder to find which figment you're missing in a walkthrough, and the game makes it even harder to narrow down because it only shows you the totals for the mind instead of the individual areas. Yeah, this applies to all collectibles, but it's only really a problem with the figments. They really took 2 steps forward and 1 step back with these things. As for the new collectibles, the Nuggets of Wisdom are a fun addition, serving as an uncommon collectible that's always in a hard to reach spot, but gives you an entire rank when you get it. I just wish there were more of these, because there are plenty of areas that seem like they should give you a nugget cognitive wisdom for getting there, but they only reward you with a figment instead. Then there are the chests in the overworld, which give you large sums of Psychonauts. It's a much more fun way to grind than the dowsing rod. Speaking of the dowsing rod, it kinda comes back in the form of the thought tuner, which you need to get to certain collectibles. It uses the same hot and cold gimmick, but it's much more forgiving, lets you know when to use it, and requires no button mashing. So basically, it brings back all the good stuff about the dowsing rod with none of the downsides. Also, if you're wondering about the scavenger hunt, that's a side quest now. Yeah, this game has side quests. There aren't a lot of them, but they're there if you want to do them. They require a lot of exploration around the hub world, but they net you some good rewards, usually another rank, and unlike the side stories in the first game, they don't expire. Speaking of which, I should probably mention the point of no return. At a certain point in the game, you won't be able to go back to the Mother Lobe, Quarry, or Questionable area until you beat the game, at which point you could go anywhere you want. The game does warn you when this point comes up, but the warning isn't very specific, so I figured I would clear that up. The story reason for this is pretty weak, but at least it's not a hard point of no return this time. Speaking of the hub world, it's a joy to explore. Whispering Rock was fun, but this place blows it out of the water. Each hub area has a lot of unique locations and fun ways to travel between them, plus a fast travel system for further apart areas. The variety in traversal options and platforming challenges makes finding all the collectibles a lot of fun. It might seem like there's less to explore because there are only 4 areas, but these areas are much bigger than the areas of Whispering Rock, and they open up to you as you progress, with things really opening up after beating Hollis's mind. Also, with that point of no return, the location it strands you at still has a lot to explore, as opposed to Thorny Towers, which was pretty restrictive until you got past the elevator, at which point it became very linear. I can't believe I've gone this long without bringing it up, but I might as well talk about the controls. They're better than the original. The original's controls were fine, but not amazing. Here they're a bit smoother. Certain actions, mainly swinging on bars, are a bit easier to deal with. The grind rail physics are still weird though, and the new wall jump feels pretty pointless. Now for the moment you've all been waiting for. How are the mines? I'm not gonna go into specifics because I have another video planned about that. Trust me, that's gonna be a fun one. But I will speak about them more generally. For starters, how many are there? This was the main thing I wanted to know leading up to release. I legit cared more about that than the release date. Well, there are 13 of them compared to the original's 10, but that doesn't mean what you might assume it does. You see, several characters have multiple mental levels, and while they're counted separately, they're essentially one level in terms of length and the stories they tell. So it's more like 9, and even then, a few of the levels are on the shorter side. As for content, there are a few things to know. For basically the first half of Psychonauts, it felt like you had training wheels on, as 3 of the 4 mines felt like tutorial levels, and the other one constantly forced you to leave so you could learn new skills. I'm happy to report that every mine can be finished in one visit, although certain collectibles require you to come back later if you're going for completion, and it feels like the training wheels come off right as you enter the second mine, instead of almost halfway through the game. The mines also have a wide variety of clever themes, most of which combine multiple ideas to create something truly unique. Even in the worst mines in the game, I can't say the concepts they chose were generic or boring like I can for a couple of the mines in Psychonauts. Speaking of which, nothing here is as bad as the meat circus. About half of the mines are on a similar level to the Asylum mines, and a few more aren't far behind. In terms of gameplay, they're not as unique as the levels in the original and fall more into standard 3D platforming fare, which is a bit of a double-edged sword, but works out overall as the quality is much more consistent. So at the end of it all, was it worth it? Did Psychonauts 2 meet my expectations? Yes. It gave me everything I was hoping for in a sequel and is a major step up from the original. I'll admit there are some things like the comedy and side stories that the original does better, but I think this is a better game overall. I am Defoffilizer, and tune in next time where I rank every mental world in both games. That's gonna be a fun one. A big thank you to the SMR for supporting me on Patreon. If you want your name listed off at the end of my videos, consider donating too.